good evening, good afternoon, good morning to friends across the world. This is indeed a pleasure for me to be invited on this conference, uh, on creative resistance and environmental justice, rethinking ecofeminism. I would, from the very beginning, thank Julia Costed and Shuddho and all other groups that are part of this uh, conference. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. So let me start off without much delay. My area of research has been on the Uttara Kannada district of Karnataka. It's the southern state of Karnataka in India. And I have tried to understand an environmental movement called the Appiko Chaluvali in that district, right? So I'm going to be relating to that in trying to understand and see how women who participated in the movement back in the 80s and also even now, how have they reimagined or how have they been creative in their resistance and for environmental justice, and through this thinking through ecofeminism. Should I enlarge the screen, or is that okay?
I think we can see your slides perfectly, so it's really up to you.
Okay, so I can then also control the slides on the side. So the focus of this research in recent years, not of this research, in recent years, attention has been focused on, highlighting the connections between women and nature. And there's been a lot of work that has been coming up over the last few years. In Western and Indian thought, metaphors link women with nature, and women in nature are described as Mother Earth. Just a minute, let me change this. It's going. Yeah. The destruction of nature is described in terms of violence like the rape of the sea or rape of the earth. Communities have struggled collectively to regain control over productive natural resources and to defend their livelihoods and lifestyles. And women have been in the forefront of protest movements over protection of the environment. Within this context, this presentation examines the Appiko Chaluvali, as I mentioned, in the state of Karnataka in India. It examines what role gender plays in understanding environmental issues, whether there exists a close connection between women and nature uniformly across nations, regions, and communities. It examines the relationship between gender and nature by examining the main tenets of ecofeminism, the alternatives suggested through feminist environmentalism of Bina Agarwal. And what one attempts to do is to rethink the discourse of ecofeminism and suggest the need to look at the women and nature discourse from a feminist political ecology perspective in the context of the global South. So just to touch upon the emergence of ecofeminism, this is something I think across the panel today, people will be touching upon it. It emerged in the 1970s with the increasing consciousness of the connections between women and nature. It was a product of the peace, feminist, and ecology movements of the late 1970s and the early 1980s. The term ecofeminism was coined by the French writer François Duvaux in 1974 and further developed by Ernesta King, pointing to the interconnections of theory and practice and the devaluation of earth by corporates. And this was seen as a feminist issue. It has developed into a large, after that we see conferences, books, journal articles on the issue of ecofeminism across disciplines. Ecofeminism thus includes those perspectives that are usually unrecognized in the mainstream, focusing on the aspect of exploitation of women and nature through male domination. If one thinks about the nature of ecofeminism, it refers both to movements and to a set of ideas at the intersection of feminism and radical environmentalism. And it points to the historical, material, and ideological connections between nature and women that are both subjugated and dominated. It puts forward a worldview that believes in the care and diversity of all life forms. And movements that are labeled as ecofeminist, like the Green Belt movement in Kenya, the Chipko movement in India, the anti-militarist movement in the US and Europe, reflect the politics of resistance at the nodes of power that plays out at the micro level. Then one goes on to look at the different perspectives within ecofeminism, because this is not some, just like the feminist movement, there's no single strand, but there are differing perspectives. So the different perspectives reflect the different ways of analyzing the connections between women and nature. So the liberal ecofeminists, for them, the environmental problems result from rapid development of natural resources and the failure to regulate pesticides and other environmental pollutants. And they argue that given equal educational opportunities to become scientists, natural resource managers, regulators, lawyers, and legislators, women, like men, can contribute to the improvement of the environment, conservation of natural resources, and a higher quality of human life. Women, therefore, can transcend social stigma of their biology and join men in cultural project of environmental conservation. The other strand is the radical cultural ecofeminism, which stems from an anti-science, anti-technology standpoint. It celebrates the relationship between women and nature through the revival of ancient rituals, which are centered on goddess worship, the moon, animals, and the female reproductive system. Women's biology and nature are celebrated as sources of female power. The socialist ecofeminism, it critiques capitalist patriarchy that focuses on the dialectical relationships between production and reproduction and between production and ecology. The debates that women's bodies are turned into production machines, into sites of experiment with vested interests to test birth control techniques and devices, contraceptives, and for in vitro fertilization experiments. So this is just briefly to look at the different strands of ecofeminism. Coming to India, one of the most well-known ecofeminists is Vandana Shiva, well-known and celebrated feminist Vandana Shiva. Vandana Shiva analyzes modern science and technology as something that's Western, patriarchal, and colonial project that is inherently violent and perpetuates this violence against women and nature. It has meant, she argues, a shift again, away from Prakriti, that is nature, as a living creative force, the feminine principle from which all life arises. And instead now it's seen as a passive force and as a resource that can be exploited mercilessly. And women's special knowledge of nature and their dependence on it for staying alive systematically is marginalized by modern science. So she and Mario Mies, they put forth the subsistence perspective, which is rooted in the material base of everyday subsistence production and of women all over the world. The subsistence base can become the common ground for women's liberation and the preservation of life on earth. Or a critique of this was put forward by Beena Agarwal, the feminist economist, who puts forward the idea of feminist environmental perspective that is rooted in the material reality that sees the relation between women and nature as structured by gender and class, caste, race. So these intersectionalities are there in the organization of production, reproduction, and distribution. And the dominant forms of development have led to devaluation, she argues, and marginalization of women's indigenous knowledge and skills that are acquired through their everyday interaction with nature. Simultaneously, untrained, to use new technologies women excluded from the planning process. And so with that, a degradation and privatization of natural resources, the material base of women's knowledge is declining. If one looks at the critiques of ecofeminism that have been put forward by feminists and others, it emphasizes that the ecofeminist perspective is ethnocentric, it is essentialist, it is ahistorical, it ignores the material sphere, overlooking differential identities and intersections like caste, class, race, region, religion, ethnicity, and others. It is also, it constrains women as merely caring and nurturing beings, which is regressive and reinforces the stereotypes instead of liberating women. Against this background, one sees that, if one tries to analyze ecofeminism, women's interaction with nature and their responses to environmental degradation must be analyzed and located within the material reality of gender, caste, class, and race-based division of labor, property, and power. Women are victims of environmental degradation, as well as active agents in the regeneration and protection of the environment. The adverse class gender effects of these processes are reflected in the erosion of indigenous knowledge systems and livelihood strategies on which the poor, the rural women depend. So against this background, we will now analyze this in the context of the Appiko movement, Appiko Chaluvali of Karnataka, the Western Ghats in India. This is a glimpse of the beautiful Western Ghats of India, all along the western coast. Just to give you, just to keep this beautiful picture in place, while I just give you the details. It's located between 13.55 degrees to 15.32 degrees north latitude and 74.05 to 75.05 east longitude, covering an area of around 10,291 square kilometers. And forests are a dominant feature of the district. So this, if you can see, it's the Western Ghats is from here to here, and this is the state of Karnataka, and the highlighted is the district of Uttara Kannada. And this district was known as the Pepper Queen during the colonial times. It was part of a brisk trade in spices to Europe. And expansion of spice trade resulted in changes in the upland economy and ecologies. Pepper gathered from the forest also began to be grown in the spice gardens. And dependence on the forest was vital for the community of settled agriculturists for their spice gardens. Talking about the spice gardens of Uttara Kannada district, or UKD, they are multi-layered spice gardens that grow pepper vines on the arecanut or betelnut, commonly known as betelnut, that alternate with the banana plant, the cardamom, the cocoa, and vanilla and nutmeg, and other fruit trees like mango, jackfruit, coconut. Let me just give you a glimpse of this. This is one of the, the spice gardens that are that dot the Uttara Kannada district, especially in the Malenadu or the Upghat regions, right? And so you can see these tall arecanut trees, betelnut trees, and here you have the pepper vines, and you have the banana leaves, banana plants, the cardamom, and various others, right? These gardens are, pepper earlier used to be gathered from the forest. Now it is grown in, not now, oh, many centuries, it's now being grown in the gardens as well. And the dependence on forests is something that is vital for the community of settled agriculturists for the spice gardens as well as their livestock. If you look at the spice gardens of Uttara Kannada district, they are multi-layered spice gardens, as I said, all these. And the traditional practices of these spice gardens reflect a very strong environmental sensitivity. So to prevent soil erosion and management of water resources during the monsoon months, 4 months during the monsoons, these farmers have evolved innovative systems. And spice gardens, they are grown very strategically in the valleys with stormwater drains along the sides. There's leaf mulching, there's fresh soil that is used from the Sopinabetta lands, that is the forest lands, which are used exclusively for collecting leaf mulch, twigs, and soil in this region, right? And farming is usually combined with animal husbandry. And for a gardener, it is important to maintain cattle for his own family's use, as well as for the sake of his plantation. And in recognition of the indigenous agricultural systems developed, the Food and Agricultural Organization gave the GIAS, or the globally important agricultural heritage systems tag, for the Sopinabettas in 2008. Let me just, so this is something that, it's a very unique agricultural system that has been developed here in the Uttara Kannada district in the Upghat regions. You can see here the betelnut, which has been plucked and kept for drying. And this is someone, the women labor are peeling that. And these are peppercorns, the green peppercorns and the black pepper once deseeded and put up. But this beautiful Western Ghat region, which was very rich and well known as the pepper queen, as I said earlier, post-independence began to be looked at as a backward district, as a forested district that is backward, it has no development, etc. So in the post-independence period, what one sees is that a slew of programs and projects are being implemented here to develop this region. So a number of forestry programs were started, hydroelectric power projects in the rivers of the Bedti and the Kali, mining for manganese and limestone to contribute to India's growth story. Social forestry projects introduced in the 80s, followed by the Joint Forest Management Program in the 1990s. All of these catered to commercial requirements for timber rather than the local needs. In the post-1990s period, post-liberalization, projects of national importance were initiated, like the nuclear power plant at Kaiga, the project Seabird at Karwar, that's a naval infrastructure project, multiple dam projects in the Kali River, infrastructure projects like highways, rail lines, port development, underground power projects of the Sharavati sanctuary, and so on, right? So against this background of ecological devastation, what we see is a number of environmental movements beginning in this region. And Appiko Chaluvali is one of the movements that began in the 1980s because this development and conservation projects led to fragmentation of the forests, and resources were being exhausted, and this led to a number of protest movements. And the Appiko Chaluvali, which is spearheaded by the Havyak cultivating Brahmin families there in that region, they spearheaded, or in fact, they led the movement. It was joined by various castes and classes in the 80s. And as Amita Bhaviskar mentions, it's something that combined both green and ecological issues, green ecological issues and red class politics, issues of class politics. Issues of environment and livelihood are something that is also closely interlinked, as Gail Ombut has pointed out in her, when she talks about the Appiko Chaluvali. This movement, just to give you a history, a brief history of the Appiko Chaluvali, it began in the summer of 1983, where, started by villagers who witnessed the devastation of the forest, which is led by the local plywood factory, who had been given permission by the forest department to fell trees. The Yuvak Mandalis, or the youth clubs, they mobilized the villagers of Salkani and Gubigadde, and they protested. They went in large numbers and protested by hugging the trees and prevented the woodcutters from felling. Emin Hegde of Gubigadde village, he says, the Appiko movement ran on donations in kind. The villagers nearby provided food and drink. The people would go to the forests in batches and keep vigil day and night. This way, the villagers' work in the gardens would not get disturbed. Anand Hegde, he has taken Appiko as his middle name. He runs a printing press. He helped in the movement by printing the posters and pamphlets that were required for the movement. Now, if one looks at the women's participation, what was it? How was it that women participated in the movement? So what we see is that the women actively participated in the movement. They kept a vigil over trees that had been already cut and piled by contractors in the forest, in the various protest movements that they had, protests that they held in front of the forest department office, etc., or in shibirs, that is camps, where they cooked meals for those staying in the camps and so on. They wrote Bhavageethes, that is poems which are set to music with the environmental theme, and participated in the Yakshagana, or the folk dance drama, which is very special of this region. One of the activists, Gange, who was the mother of a laborer, she said that during the Appiko movement, we went into the forest and hugged the trees. I would finish my cooking and go into the forest, and someone else would take the cattle out to graze. So if one looks at, since this is talking about creative resistance, I took up one little poem, or Bhavageethes, as that had been set up, that had been written by Vijaya Hegde and M.N. Hegde. It says, "Come, sister, don't be late. Let us go into the forest. Let us go to stop the murder of the trees in the forest. Mother's green wealth is our way of life. It's the farmer's lifebread, and it's the nation's forest wealth. We shall stop them all, the butchers who cut the trees, the rascals who destroy the forest, the sinners who strip the mother naked. Let us hug the trees. We do not fear the axe. Let our heads roll on the ground. Let blood flow in a canal." What these Bhavageethes and some of the Yakshagana write-ups that I had analyzed highlights the participants' sort of emotional attachment to the forest, and poignantly, it's poignantly manifested in this. It sort of reaffirms that protecting trees is their own moral responsibility, and reflects an awareness that forests produce is inseparable a part of their livelihood, an existential imperative. And nature is romanticized, and its wholeness and splendor, in all its wholeness and splendor. And greenery symbolizes wealth, symbolizes its wealth and prosperity, and their readiness also to sacrifice their lives for nature protection, right? Coming to recent times, what we see is that women in this region have, showed their creative resistance in terms of developing the home gardens. So this region, as I showed you in the slides earlier, is something that is the betelnut economy, the spice garden economy, and now especially the betelnut economy is the dominant sort of economy, right, of this region. And that is the one which has exchange value, huge exchange value. So women in this region now have begun to start home gardens, agroforestry home gardens close to their homes, which are maintained largely through their labor. And these home gardens provide vital household inputs like vegetables, tubers, medicinal plants, and fruits and flower-bearing plants, unlike the dominant betelnut economy. And it enhances the household food security, nutrition, and well-being. So these living gene banks, they conserve the traditional crop varieties and seeds. So the produce from these are high in use value, but low in terms of exchange value. And women have initiated also dairy melas, or it's the flower festivals, seed collectives, marketing cooperatives, which have provided a vital input for kitchen and for the kitchen garden, for the kitchen, and give them a sense of empowerment and fulfillment. And it has also provided diverse food stocks that meet the dietary needs. And it has also diversified the home income, providing cash incomes to women. One can see one of the kitchen gardens. This is Vinodaka going into her kitchen garden next to her, and she's the one who maintains that, which, as I said, provides the inputs that are required. Also, there's examples of farmers like Veda Hegre from Nirnalli village, who's won a lot of recognition and awards from governments as well as NGOs for her farming abilities. And she says, the pride is that my profession is agriculture. She claims that women are showing interest in different forms of farming, apiary, vegetables, floriculture, and women's labor, both within and outside the household, is something that is very, very integral to the agroecological system. Shamala Hegre of Vardinkoppa, she also says that farming is an occupation which must involve commitment and involvement from both Gandasru and Hengasru, that is men and women. So she cooks for farm workers, guests and family, and takes care of the land at all times. It's only then that her husband Pandurang Hegre, who's a farmer and environmentalist, can actually go out and do his ecological work. Here is a picture of Veda Hegre in her farm, in her dairy, right? So also in 2001 onwards, there is a group that has started, a collective that has been started called Vanastari, that's the Women of the Forest. That's a seed-saving women's collectives founded in 2001. And the objective is to preserve and promote forest garden biodiversity, small-scale food systems through conservation of traditional seeds and tubers. And women's lives are intrinsically linked with seeds, you know, and the power to realize and assert their critical role in the sociological and ecological health. So this seed collective sort of has recognized the role of women farmers and gardeners, which is integral to the social and cultural and ecological fabric of the Malnad region. And they point out that dynamic solutions exist in small-scale working models in local ecosystems that challenge the global food security. Right? So now we come to the issue of gender environment. Some questions. How does one analyze the efforts of the women to preserve the biodiversity along with livelihood needs? Do we understand it in terms of the essentialist ideas of ecofeminism, of women's innate closeness to nature, and their special relationship with nature? Or do we understand it in terms of the feminist environmental notions of paying attention to the material basis of women's lives? Or do we understand it from the perspective of feminist political ecology? That is the gendered power relations and the deconstruction of the household and denaturalization of the relationships between environment and gender. How does one analyze this? If one looks at the development strategies identified women as mothers and wives who are naturally predisposed towards nurturing and self-sacrifice, reflecting a maternal altruism. The association between women and environment, the naturalism, closeness, was constituted as a distinct advantage for women, which yields privileged knowledge. And this was incorporated as a basis of development policies. This is critiqued by feminist environmentalism of Beena Agarwal, who argues for a material understanding of the relation between women and the environment, which is born of specific work responsibilities. And as Sarah Jewett points out, women are not an undifferentiated and tokenistic category, and what one needs to do is to situate them within the local power and authority hierarchies that disadvantage them within the wider social relations. And when we come to feminist political ecology, it sort of highlights the intersections of gender, race, caste, and class that shape environment relations. It endorses a critique of feminist environmentalism, critiques the essentialist lens of feminist analysis of the environment, and it looks at the power relations that are inherent in people's access to and control of resources. It emphasizes the idea that women too can be creators, knowers, and producers of knowledge. The issues of social equity and social justice are emphasized, and the focus on the imbalance of power relations is sort of highlighted. Feminist political ecology also helps a gendered analysis of knowledge production and the way power and politics influence the use, access, and distribution of resources and of grassroots environmental action. So in the Uttara Kannada district, women's knowledge of plants and their needs for the household are encouraged in terms of their kitchen garden agroforestry processes. This does not clash with the larger social sanctions. Women are encouraged to start small enterprises, floriculture, beekeeping, dairying, and sell the produce in the markets or through festivals. This reflects the power relations at work, where the less productive, less valued kitchen garden agroforestry practices of women are encouraged by the family and society. Seed collectives like Vanastri have brought together women of different castes, class, ethnic groups. They've shared embodied experiences of environmental degradation and efforts at rejuvenation. And what we see is that the collective experiences have brought them together to nurture biodiversity of the region and celebrate their knowledge and experiences together. To conclude, what I would argue is that women's agency and creative resistance is reflected in their involvement in the Appiko movement, in the sit-ins that they participated in the writings of the Bhavageethes and their participation in the Yakshaganas. It's also reflected in their lead in developing home gardens and preserving the biodiversity of the region. So these, the gendered agroforestry practices look after their everyday needs of the locals, though, as I said, low on exchange value, but it's high on use value. And hence it's necessary to analyze the Appiko movement from a feminist political ecology perspective. A feminist political ecology perspective highlights the intersections of caste, class, gender at play, shaping environmental relations. It recognizes the existence of power relationships that are inherent in people's access to and control of resources, and emphasizes issues of social equity and social justice. It notes that women too can be creators and producers of knowledge. Thank you. This is this is Adike Tota, or you can see the spice garden at the back, and in front is the paddy fields and the house of one of the farmers.